So it's all good. We're in the Kunlan and Ablat Gemara. We're on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, the very top of the page. We're finally coming back to Rosh Hashana, the name of this Masechta, and the Rosh Hashana that we're all familiar with from Tishrei. So we are learning the dinim of Shofar, and it says in the Mishnah, the very top line, Piv Mitzupa Zav. Actually, I think we said it yesterday. We'll go quick through again. And if it's coated with gold, but Tanya, didn't we learn that in the Beis Hamikdash it was coated with gold, the shofar, and the chatzetzes, the trumpets, were with silver? Says the Gemara, but Tanya, didn't we learn that if you actually coat it with gold around the place where you put your mouth, it is possible because it's not just the sound of a shofar that you have in your mouth. You have also gold. Only if it's not, it's like an embroidery on top, it's kosher. He's talking about where that the gold is further up, it's just a decoration rather than placed where the mouthpiece is. Okay, then the Mishnah continues. In the times of the Beis Hamikdash, they had also two trumpets, and the trumpets were on the side, and the shofar was in the middle. By a fast day, when you had to have a trumpet, the shofars were on the side because they also blew, and the trumpets were in the middle. Says the Gemara. Right now, the Gemara thinks that we're able to hear all the sounds at the same time. For the Gemara, but today, how can you hear different sounds at the same time? But Tanya, didn't we learn? Hashem, it says Zochar. The first one says Dibur, says Zochar Shem Shabbos Kacha. The second one says Dibur, says Shomer Shem Shabbos. The Dibur Echa Nemru, and we say that they both said at the same time. Masha Ein Hapeh Yochol Daber. Nobody, a person cannot possibly say two different words at the same time, and so too, a person cannot hear. So you cannot hear two different sounds at the same time. So how can you have a shofar and a chatzetzes? So when it answers lekach maimer b'shofar, you're right. That's why the shofar, the sound of the shofar, the blast of the shofar goes longer than the chatzetzes. So there's that part of the sound you can hear on its own. And you're right. While they're both blowing in tandem, you cannot really hear the sounds. So the Gemara then concludes, okay, so what are you really telling me? That while the shofar was blowing and the trumpets, you're not yetzer with that sound, but what are you yetzer with is, you yetzer with the remaining sound of the blast of the shofar once you stop blowing the chatzetzes. Ask the Gemara members, what are you trying to say? If you hear the end of the sound without the beginning of the sound, yes, it's good enough. And therefore I can conclude a partial sound is good enough. And it makes no difference if it's the end of the sound, the beginning of the sound, so you get to either one, as long as you hear part of the sound. So I have questions on both. So first let me ask a question. Toshma, learned, what happens? We're in Gemara about 10 lines on top of the page. So it seems from here that if you blow shofar and you hear only a part of the sound, because part of the sound is masked by the sound of the trumpets. The main thing is you hear part of the sound of the shofar solo, that's good enough. So a partial sound is good enough. So that's a question. It says, what happens? The first key, you blew properly. Then you did your the middle blows, and then you did another key at the end. And then your key at the end, you blew a lot longer than normal because you want it to be the beginning of your next set. You have Malchus, Zechrein, and Shofar, so you blew the set by Malchus. Now you want to say, let's say, blow by the set of Zechrein. So you're blowing for your next set. And you blew it long enough for two, all you have is one sound, and you have to repeat the sound again. Now the question is, why? You're telling me a partial sound is good enough, so why don't you count this as two partial sounds? Because you're having in mind the first part of the sound to be the end of one bracket, and the second part of the sound should be the beginning of the next bracket. Why don't you count it as two keys, one for the end and one for the beginning? So says, that's very different. One sound to break it up into two and treat it as two, that's a different thing altogether. We're talking about you hearing a part of a sound, it's good enough, a partial sound. But to take one sound and split it in two, that's something else. Okay, I'll ask another question. Toshma, we're going to learn in the Mishnah coming up, if somebody blew the shofar inside a boyd, a boyd is a pit in the ground, and a dus is either a pit in the ground with a wall surrounding it, not just sand, or it's it's above the ground. Or pit him inside a barrel, and why would he be blowing inside a barrel? So it says in some of the Rishonim, when they go in, there's time when there were decrees, gzeras, that you're not allowed to blow shofar, so they wouldn't blow it in public or something. They would go inside a barrel and hopefully contain the sound. So if you're blowing inside a barrel, so it depends. Im koil shayfer shama yotz. If you heard the sound of a shayfer, you are yotz. But the im koil havara shama yotz. You hear the sound of an echo, you're not yotz. Now, Big Machayisham how to learn this, but we'll get to the Mishnah. I'll tell you. Now, the question is very simple. Even if you hear the sound of an echo, first you hear the for first few seconds you hear the original, then the echo comes in. So my late a bit why aren't you still yotz? You heard part of the sound, and then the rest became the echo. But you're saying partial sounds good enough. So Gemara said you're right. Gemara said you're right. Elatarti koli, two voices, mechad gavra, emanating from one person, which is like Zocha v'Shomer from the Eibishter, Mishtameh. You cannot hear from one person. But today, Gavra Mishtameh, for two people, I can focus and somehow or another listen to one person and listen to the other person, and I can distinguish between the sounds. Says, what is that so? Today, Gavra, from two people, me Mishtami, you think you can hear it? Let me ask a question. But Tanya, didn't we learn? We learn when it comes to reading the Torah, echad koida, you have one person who's about koida, but echad metargim, you have another person altogether who interprets pasuk by pasuk, but they don't do it in tandem. Provided they're not doing it together. Provided they're not doing it together, the mekoida and the metargum, the way Taisus learns. They're doing it so that therefore you can hear each one. You can hear them, but each one separately. So we see that even two people, you cannot distinguish between the sounds. Or it means two people reading the Torah together, two people doing it time together. Even though it's two different people, you cannot distinguish the sounds, and therefore we want. Even though we have today about Qaeda, the person who goes up there to get an aliyah, but the person who has aliyah has to read, he reads it very low, so he's not interrupting. So you're right, the Holei Damya Ella L'Seif. So Gemara says, you know what? By Shayfa, we're going to compare it to the next case. So you're right. By Kiddush Ataydi, you can have two people reading in tandem. But by Kiddush Shayfa, we'll treat it like by Halul Megillah Filasora Kaidin. You have 10 different people reading the Megillah in unison. And when you have 10 different people, it's impossible they're all reading the same pace, the same pitch. And so one person might be ahead, one person might be behind. And yet you can hear it. Why? Alma Kim the Chaviv, you have it because it's once a year you hear the Megillah, or even Halal once a month. So therefore you are very, you're focused, and therefore when you're focused, you can actually distinguish. Even the Chaviv, since the Shefer is something that you have once a year, you want to really hear it. You have that you can apply yourself, and you can actually and you can hear. So you could. So therefore, what you could hear two voices at the same time, but. So says the Gemara. The Gemara concluded, you cannot. A partial voice is no good. A partial voice is no good. So if a partial voice is no good, how come we hear the shofar and the chatzitzis at the same time in the times of basic English? So we're saying it because it's chaviva. You can apply yourself. No, if that's the case, so why did the blowing of the blast of the shofar continue outdo the blast of the trumpets? He answers, why were you ma'adik in the shofar? You know why? As the Mishnah says, everyone should realize that the main thing is the shofar, and that's why by a time is the main thing is the trumpet. So therefore, the trumpets outlast the shofar. We said the Mishnah when it comes to tiny, we use the meram kfufin, and by tiny, everyone agrees it should be bent because you have to be subdued. And it was coated with silver. So you can understand. Why when it comes to shofars we coated with gold, and why when it comes to a fast on the trumpets we use silver. So we give a few answers. Everything about the gathering should be made out of silver. And how do we know that? It says, the entire trumpet is made out of silver. That's number one. Or I can say, the Torah has pity on them, as is very sparing with money of a yid, and that's why it says if you have a nega in your house, you have a leprosy in your house, before you call in the kohen, take out all your furniture, your belongings, your furnishings, and then bring in the kohen. So therefore, the items in your house are not tummy, even though it turned out to be retrospectively was tummy. It doesn't become tummy until the kohen declares it. So we see the Torah is very concerned about the person's material assets. That's why the shofar, the trumpets are made out of silver. It's far cheaper than gold. So the Gemara said, "No, the shofar also nami nabedi kesef." What about the shofar? Answers the Gemara. Nevertheless, covered Yom Tov adif. The covered of Yom Tov surpasses this concern about Torah Chosam Yisrael, and therefore for shofar we will blow. It's not like a fast day for tzaddis; it's for Yom Tov. So it's part of the mitzvah to beautify the mitzvah, and therefore we'll make it out of gold. Never really understood, when do we apply the rule of Torah Chasam Amaynu Yisrael, and when do we apply the rule of Ein Aniyas B'Makom Ashiris? In the place where you're supposed to be, wealth and profligate, don't be parsimonious.
I always thought that Ein Aniyas is only in the Mikdash, but when it comes
Sorry?
to private individual, I always thought that Ein Aniyas El B'Makom Ashiris, that's only in the Mikdash, but when or in the Beis Knesses, but when it comes to a private individual, there we say Chas Al Mamayim.
Yeah, but these chatzaitzes are also in the Beis Hamikdash. The chatzaitzes you blew together with the shofar was only in the Beis Hamikdash. So we're talking about in the Beis Hamikdash, and yet they used dafka silver because Torah Chasam Amaynu Yisrael. Unless, because it's two possibilities. The chatzaitzes essentially was used for a tainus, which is for private use. People were in tzadus, or even community. But you're right. So that maybe because it's not a certain Beis Hamikdash, it's just. They used it also in the Beis Hamikdash to augment the sound of the shofar or to enhance it, but nevertheless primarily used for things outside the Beis Hamikdash. So maybe that's why. Versus the shofar, but the shofar was not the Beis Hamikdash. Shofar don't do the Beis Hamikdash. It's a mitzvah. But the different the shofar, because it's only used during a mitzvah or primarily used for a mitzvah. So maybe there, but the Gemara doesn't say here Ein Ani Magashir. One gives a whole different thing. The Gemara said because covered yontiv adif. So it maybe that even a mitzvah is not good enough yet to spend all that money, if not for the fact that the cover of the mitzvah, nothing to do with Ein Ani Magashir. But you're right. You maybe only using the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so let's continue. The Gemara now says there were a number of Amoraim who thought that they should replicate this particular activity, so they should have a shofar with a chatzaitzah. Says the Gemara. Papa wanted to do something like the Mishnah. He wanted to have not only shofar, but also this trumpet. And the Rabbi was at him. This only applies to the Beis Hamikdash. The Mikdash, only Beis Hamikdash. They also had the trumpets on the side. But outside the Beis Hamikdash, if, for example, it's a fast day and the primary focus is on the trumpets, ain't shofar. You don't blow shofar. And mokum sheyesh shofar, the primary like Yom Tov Rosh Hashana, which is all about shofar, ain't chatzais, there's no trumpets. Likewise, hini like al Mishnah, Chalafta b'tzipor. He also wanted trumpets and shofar. Chananya ben Tzadin, they thought it was a wonderful minig. B'sichni, however, ukesheba, when they came, the Chum found out, Amru lahoya noigein. The only place that they used to do this was b'shari mizrach b'harabayis b'vad, only in the eastern gate by the harabayis. Or it means either an entry base of Mikdash, or it means the Ezras Nashim. What's the possible? See what it says. How do we know? First of all, you blow a trumpet, and how do you know it's only limited to the base of Mikdash? Which says the pasuk. You should blow where? Lifnei hamelech Hashem. Only before the Eibush of the base of Mikdash. Melech Hashem to be in the chatzei shofar. Only there you blew both. But in the shul, everywhere else you don't. Then the Mishnah said, Shaveh haYevel, that Yevel, remember Rabbi Yehuda we had this guy Shaveh there, that Yevel is similar. The Tanakhama said that Yevel is similar to Shana when it comes to the Tkiyas and when it comes to the brachas, which we learned in the 9 brachas that we say in Musaf, also do on Yom Kippur. Says the Gemara, Keman Matlin. So according to who do we daven today? When we say Rosh Hashana, Zeh Hayom Tchilas Maasecha Zikaron Le'Imnisha. Come on, who says that the world was created? That today was the beginning of your activities, and this reminds you of the very first day. That follows Rabbi Lezer, who says, "But Tishrei Reilah." They may have an argument if you're whether the world was created Tishrei, the world was created Nisan. So this must follow Rabbi Lezer that the world was created in Tishrei. Now, if according to Rabbi Yeshua, the reason why Rosh Hashana is Rosh Hashana, not because of the beginning of the year, according to Rabbi Yeshua, the reason why Rosh Hashana is Rosh Hashana is because that's when the Eibishter forgave us in Yom Kippur for the luchas, and therefore he decided is rachmim and chasodim that we should have the judgment day then, so we can do tshuva because the Eibishter then is in the mood of accepting forgiveness, the tshuva and giving atonement. Very interesting taste. So it sounds like we passed in halacha l'maisa like Rabbi Lezer was created in Tishrei. Yet we learned last time when it comes to Kufa, it comes to seasons, we paskin like Rabbi Yeshua that was created in Nisan. And we spoke about the Ran different views of what Allah is. Taisa says here an interesting thing. The Taisa Kamam Matzlin, at the very end, Taisa says, how is it that Rabbi Elazar Kalir, big argument who Rabbi Elazar Kalir is, he wrote many liturgies, a big argument whether he was a Tana, a Rishon, some say even Rabbi Elazar Menurkus. I'm not sure exactly who he was. And he writes, in one poem, he writes that the world was created Tishrei, and on Pesach, he writes a poem there that the world was created in Nisan. How can they both be true? So Rabbeinu Tam says towards the end, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, like we say that both opinions both have basis in Elokim Chaim, and that Taisa comes a very interesting compromise. The equal member we can say, the betish. I'm just quoting the end of Taisa's here. Kaman Maslina. The betishrei ola b'machshava lebaras. The Eibishter intended to create the world in Tishrei. It wasn't created until the month of Nisan. What exactly that means, not sure. Because the time didn't really begin until the world was created. So in the world of Machshava, the world was created in Tishrei. In the world of Maisa, the world was created in Nisan. With the Kavasa Ashma, where do you find such a concept? We find it in the Pedagogy of Passim. We had him say Erevin. Gabi Adam, by a person. Sha'olah b'machshava lebarish. He wanted to create Chav and Adam together in tandem. But then he created Adam, and then afterwards he created Chav, according to that one opinion. So we find that in the world of Machshava, there's one thing that's happening, and the Eibish's Machshava, Kiloi Machshava, Machshava Seichem. The Machshava is totally different than ours, and the world of Mice is different. So Tefus made a compromise that both true. Tishrei was created in the world of Machshava, and in the world of Mice was created in this.
The other way around, you mean?
Sorry?
You mean the other way around? Tishrei is Maisa and Nisan is Machshava.
No, I don't mean the other way. I mean exactly what I just said.
So I'm misunderstanding you because
look at Taisel again. The Tishrei ola b'machshava lebaris, b'v'lei nivra ad Nisan.
So it fits like Rabbi Yeshua.
No, because the world of we're following we're saying because that's true in Machshava. And it comes to the seasons, which is Negeah to Elam Hamaisa, we follow Nisan, Rebbe Lezer. So they're both correct. The activities of Maisa we follow Nisan, the activities of Machshava we follow, or Rosh Hashana is in the world of Machshava.
So then Chafhei Be'elul, when we celebrate when we acknowledge the beginning of the Bria process, what was that? B'machshava?
Well, the share we had last time about the Ran says clearly that if we follow the Ma'aser of Eliezer, we should not be started saying slichas at all. And there are people that know that Rebbe Shab writes in Torah didn't say slichas, that people don't say slichas at all, because what for? The world was created in Nisan. What are you saying slichas? And others say the Sfardim that you start from Rosh Chodesh El, because they say that the reason is only because of the second luchas, and if it's the luchas, then the third. Then it started when Moshe Rabbeinu went the third time, Rosh Chodesh El. That's when the Mechila started. So we should then Slicha Mechila. So we should start saying Slicha then. But we're hedging our bets, so we say Slicha from Chafei or 4 days before. Minimum. Okay, let's continue the Gemara. So Gemara now says, Mosi Rabbeinu asks a question. It says in our Mishnah that Shav the Yovel Rosh Hashana L'Kila Brachas. It sounds like in the Mishnah that we equate Rosh Hashana and Kippur, they're exactly the same, but they're not. But you can say you can't say that Yom Kippur. You can also say Rosh Hashana. So they're not exactly the same. So not in every respect. We're talking about the other brachas, how many brachas in Musaf, but not here. That's how Rashi means. This is what he learned. Now he asks as a formal question. It says in the Mishnah, it would seem from my Mishnah, the world was not created on Rosh Hashanah, so we do not say Zehayim Chil Masecha. Commander like Rabbi Lezer. We don't say Zehayim Chil Masecha, therefore they're the same. Because Rabbi Lezer keep them he said the world was created in Tishrei. Zehayim Chil Masecha Remedishan, the Rosh Hashanah, once again, keep Tani Ashara. We're talking about the rest. They're equal in the other things, but not in this particular bracha of this particular pasuk Zehayim Chil Masecha. Mishnah. Now we're becoming a bit more pedantic. We're going to talk about the actual shofar itself. Shofar shenizdik, a shofar that had a spout, that had a crack. The dafkai, and you glued it together. This is how Rashi learned. You glued it together, puzzle it is puzzle. Rashi learns why is it puzzle? Because it's like two shofars. We'll come back to that in a minute. Then it says in the Mishnah, dibik shivrei shofar is puzzle. If you attach layered pieces of shofar. You made one big shofar out of this possible. Why? Because it's not one shofar, it's two. So Tate already asks, so what's the difference between case number one and case number two? It's exactly the same. In fact, once you know case number one, who needs case number two? So Tate learns that shofar shenizdik means not that it was cracked all the way through and through. It was only partially cracked. And and the thing is, it's not really traveling the natural way because you put some glue there, and therefore it's possible. The Rosh defends Rashi. The Rosh says a lot of interesting Roshes in this parak. The Rosh says that because it's a crack down the length, so the sound travels along whichever side of the shofar is traveling along one shofar. If it's going on the right, it's traveling along one, going on the left, going on one. The problem is when in the second case it's layers, so your sound is traveling through three different shofars. The first part, and then there's another part above that, another part above that. And that's a bigger problem. In fact, it's much less of a chiddush. And the Mishnah is zu ve'ein tzarich le'mezu. Another machlekes Rishonim here is whether we are talking. Rashi says glue. Others argue, they say glue's not a problem because glue disappears. Glue just brings it back together. It's really one piece. We're talking about that you're melting it down in a fire. And that's the psul here. Anyway, so it's no longer the natural state. Then the third case in the Mishnah is, what about Nikiv? There's a puncture, stomach, and you sealed it in the shofar. If it in any way impacts on the sound, possible. If not, kosher. Big machlekes is showing how to learn pshat. But this clause, if it has impacted on the sound, according to some of the Shainim, we're going back to Nikiv. If that puncture was large enough that if you would have blown without sealing it, it would have affected the sound. So now when you fix it up, it's no longer this original shofar. And therefore, if it's to do with the hole. Other Shainim learn, and this halacha, that we don't care about the hole. If you sealed it back, and now the seal is impacting on the sound, so then what you're now blowing is not just the sound of a shofar, you're also having the sound of whatever this extraneous material is. Then it's possible. We'll soon see. It depends if this extraneous material is b'minoi or not b'minoi. And if not, it's kosher. Next case. You blew into a boil or into this above ground pit, or it's a wall, or into a barrel. If you heard the sound of a shofar yotze. If you heard the sound of an echo, you're not yotze. We'll see more later what that means. Likewise, another case. The guy was walking by a shul, basically his house next to a shul, you hear the sound of shofar Megillah. In other words, whether it's a mitzvah that tell like shofar, or whether mitzvahs are abundant like Megillah, if you intended to be yotze. And if you had no intention to fulfill your mitzvah, you're not yotze. Some people heard, everyone heard. And yet, Zek the difference is one had kavanah, one didn't. So it's a clear mission here that mitzvahs need kavanah, even by mitzvahs rabbanon. But those that hold the mitzvahs don't need kavanah. And in fact, in halacha we paskin that mitzvahs rabbanon don't need kavanah, only mitzvahs deraisa. How do they learn pshat in the Mishnah? Kivan liba does not mean you have kavanah to be yotze. Kivan liba means that otherwise you're a misasik, you're not even listening. You have to focus to listen to the sounds, to listen to the words, not to be yotze the mitzvah, but just to know what's going on. Not just you happen to be there and the sound floats by. You can't remember if you heard the sound, didn't hear the sound. That's loy kivan liba. But for as far as the mitzvah is concerned, you don't necessarily need kavanah. Okay, so think about it. So what have we learned? Says the Braise, let's say the shofar is very long, the kotza, you shortened it, kosher is kosher. Gorda, you scraped it down there, middle golda, and then you scraped it very, very thin, and you still left it in the original, but you just made it a lot thinner. Kosher, still kosher. So better is other mocha, you place gold, and where do you place it? Mount possible. But if you did it, let's say, as a decoration, a bit above, kosher. To pay your zob if you put gold on the inside, possibly apostle, because it affects the sound. You're not just blowing up in the chutz. The bechutz outside, it depends. If it affects the sound, possibly kosher. Nikiv, a puncture like in our Mishnah, the stomach you sealed it. If it impacts the sound, whether we're talking about the hole or we're referring to the seal, possibly kosher. Not as kosher. Nosan shofar b'ter shofar. You put one shofar inside the other shofar. If just the inner sound we hear yatsa. But if you hear the outer sound, and also by the way you hear the inside as well, you're not yatsa because it's like you have either two shofars. You're listening to the sound of two shofars, not one shofar, and the third is a shofar or because it's like a hefsek of ears impacting on the sound of the outer one. So tell what we learn. Guard if you scraped it down, whether from the inside, whether the outside, kosher, it's kosher. Guard if you scraped it down and you left it in a thin way, kosher, it's kosher. It's another price. You place one shafer inside another shafer. What about hafchay with tafkaboy? You turned it around. We'll see what that means. And you blew layatz. Amra papa light tamer doesn't mean the hafchay kicks right to like your shirt inside out. You went and you altered its natural state. You widened the narrow end where you're supposed to blow, and you narrowed the top end where we're supposed to be wider, and you're not yetze. And my time, why not? Because this follows the view of Ramasna. Havarta says the posing, Havarta Shefer. Havarta means that you pass it in its natural state. We need the way the shaper is naturally shaped. It's narrow on one end and wider on the other end. There is we blow from the narrow side and the sound comes out the wider side. We say Milah Makim Krasicha Hashem. But the Zohar actually said you should blow from the wider side and come out through the narrow side. But the evidence, machlek is if you blow from the wide side going out the narrow side. Okay, it says in the Mishnah, Dibik Shivre Shefer puzzle. If you took, let's say, a few pieces of Shefer, you glued it together, and you made one Shefer out of this puzzle. Tell them what we learned. Hoisiv olav koshu. Let's say you added something to the Shefer. It depends. So we'll have two views, one or two versions. One is a bit more strict than the other. Version number one. Bein b'mina. I don't care what you added, whether it's the same. Bein shalei b'mina, whether it's a different material. Puzzle, it is puzzle, because it has to be one Shefer, and it isn't. What about nikiv? Let's say you was a puncture of his stomach and you sealed it. So bein b'minai, whether it's the same material, bein shalai b'minai, puzzle. Tanakama holds it's always puzzle because it's like you have two shayfers. Rav Nosson says it depends. B'minai, if you sealed it with its own min, then it is kosher. It is kosher. Why is it kosher? Because it's bottled to the shayfer. Shalai b'minai, but if it's a different min, puzzle. The mina kosher, according to this view. Now, when do we say, according to Rav Nosson? Rav Nosson makes a distinction whether it is the same material or different material. When do we say the same material is kosher? Only if the majority of the shafer still remained intact, and the hole was a puncture there, and you sealed it with the same mean. Okay, then it's bottled because you still have a proper shafer even with a hole. Miklau, so we can learn from it. The shalei mina, but if you're using other material, strange, possible. Even though you look behind, most of it is possible. That's so no the chumra that if it's shalei mina, it's always possible. Good to everybody. But the master law sefer, those are more lenient, and they learn on the sefer. That is shalei mina possible. If you use other material, is possible. When are we machmed that is possible? That majority of it open up. That the hole was quite large and drive open up. Cloud the mina, but let's say if you use the same kind, even the majority would open up is kosher. And the Rabbanan disagree. They hold that if majority open up, it's always possible. When do they all agree? Is if only a minority open up. Then everyone agrees that it's all right. Then it says between possible. If you coat it with gold on the inside, possible, with the chutz on the outside, it depends if it impacted on the sound. If there was a split on the length, possible it is possible. The rochva in the width, even if in the width, in other words, part of the shefer has a big crack. If what's left next to your mouth is the size of the minimum size of a shefer, it is kosher. Being blav possible. If not, then the shefer is possible. What's considered the minimum size of a shefer? Big enough that you can cover it with your hand. So it's a tefach. You cover that part of the shefer with your hand, and part of it can go in your mouth, and part of it sticking out from the other side of your hand. Now there's a machlek is a shayim when it says in nizdik the orkat possible. There's a crack in the shefer is possible. Rashi clearly says kulay. The crack has to go down the entire length. Then it is possible. Other shayim hold that even the slightest crack, because every time you blow, it cracks more and more and more, and therefore it's already not considered a proper shefer. Because even though it didn't crack more yet, the fact that it can and it will inevitably will already renders it possible. Then the Gemara continues: if the sound was very thin, or thick, or very tutini. In all of these case, or Rashi is a very dry sound. Kosher is kosher. We don't care what kind of sound you emit from a shofar. Everyone can take the same shofar and emit a different sound. And the rule is kol hakolos kshein b'shofar. Any sound that's emitted from a shofar is kosher. Sholchu leila abu de Shmuel. They sent a letter to Shmuel's father, and they asked him, "Kotchoi, what happens? You made a hole. The toka boy, and you blew in the shofar. Yotze ya yotze." So what are you trying to say? Every horn you have to dig out, hollow it out, in order to use it as a shofar to blow. What do you mean? Kotcha the toka by yotze? You make it sound like it's b'diavad. So pshitya kulami the kotcha. Every shofar you have to hollow it out to remove the inside so that you can blow. Amar Ravashi, shekotcha bizachrusay. So the way a horn grows is you have a bone and then it forms a horn around it. And over here, instead of hollowing out and taking out the whole bone, you just made a hole inside the bone and you left part of the bone there as well. So the shofar is coated with the bone inside. But because that's the way it grows, it's kosher. I would have thought that you don't have just a shofar, you also have a bone there. And therefore it should be a chatzitzim. There's a problem. That there isn't. That is kosher because it's all part of the shofar. If somebody blows inside a pit, or inside this dus, which you learned before, is either also a pit in the ground, but with concrete walls around it, or it's above the ground. Rav Huna says, Loi shanu. Who do we say is not the Yotze? Those are people who are standing on the edge of the pit. They're not Yotze because they don't hear the sound of the shofar. They are hearing the sound of an echo. But those people are standing inside the bird yatsu because they're definitely listening to the sound of a shofar. Now, Tanya Namach we learned somebody blows inside the bird, but the teichadus yatsu yatsu. But now we learned in our Mishnah clearly lo yatsu. So how do you reconcile our Mishnah with the Brayso? We have to say shmamino. We'll have to say those inside the bird are yatsu, those above the bird are not yatsu. Others ask it as a question. Tonight in our Mishnah it says, so Machlek is Rashi and other Shem Halalam Shat. Rashi learns that those people standing above the bird are always hearing the sound of an echo, the not Yetzer, and those inside the bird are always hearing the sound of the shofar itself. The Rosh learns that no, that all that's how the Rosh learns, and Rashi learns that those. That's how the Rashi learns. The Rosh learns those inside the bird always hear the sound of the shofar itself, but those above the bird, depending where you're standing, sometimes you could be hearing the sound of the shofar, sometimes you hear the sound of the echo. So it depends where you are, and this thing of the echo is one of the basis for the question about listening to a shofar through a telephone, video, all these other mitzvahs you want to hear online. If you can answer, if you are yotze your mitzvah at all or not, because you're not listening to this original sound, you're listening to some digital sound or an echo, but not the natural sound. All based on this Gemara right here. Okay, so tomorrow night in Mitzvah Shem, we will learn at 9:20.